She walked into her father's study and found a stranger sitting in his chair, the one no one had touched in 3 years. Without thinking, without hesitating, she told him to get up. She had no idea that the man she had just corrected in front of witnesses was the one holding her family's entire future in his hands. And by the time she found out his name, it was already too late to take back what she had said. For 3 years, the chair at the head of the table had remained untouched. The dark oak had grown dull beneath a thin layer of dust, though the rest of the dining hall was kept spotless, polished daily by hands that refused to let the house forget what it once was. Rosalind Whitfield walked past that chair every morning of her life, and every morning she felt the same quiet ache settle into her chest, the same reminder that the man who once sat there, tall and steady and full of laughter, would never sit there again. The house itself seemed to hold its breath around that absence. Portraits of her father lined the hallway leading to the dining room, his painted eyes following visitors as though still presiding over every conversation held beneath his roof. Servants lowered their voices when they passed the empty chair, as if speaking too loudly might disturb a peace that no longer existed. Rosalind had asked more than once that the chair be removed, replaced, given away, anything to stop the silence it created. But something in her could never bring herself to give the order. She told herself it was tradition. She told herself it was respect. In truth, it was fear. Fear that if the chair disappeared, the last physical proof of her father's presence in that house would disappear with it. And so it remained, exactly as he had left it, waiting for a man who would never return, in a house that was slowly, quietly, losing the ability to protect the woman who loved him most. Before we go any further into this story, if you believe a daughter's love and loyalty can outlast even the darkest betrayal, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps this story reach more people, and it means you won't miss a single moment of what happens next. Whitfield Hall had once been spoken of with admiration across the county, its gardens praised in letters, its dinners remembered for years, its master known as a man whose word was worth more than any contract. Now, behind its carefully swept front steps and gleaming windows, the house survived on something far less solid than reputation. It survived on Rosalind's refusal to let anyone see how close it stood to ruin. She managed the accounts herself, though no one had taught her to. She negotiated with tradesmen in the early hours, before the household woke, so that no one would witness the quiet arguments over unpaid bills. She sold pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her late mother, gone since Rosalind was a girl of 12, one by one, never telling a soul, replacing them in their velvet boxes with paper and cotton so that a glance into her dressing table would reveal nothing wrong. Every choice she made was designed around a single purpose: to keep the world from seeing what she saw every night when the ledgers were laid bare before her. It was not vanity that drove her. It was loyalty. Her father had built this house with his own hands and his own name, and she could not bear the thought of watching it crumble under her care, could not bear the whispers that would follow if Whitfield Hall became another story of a family fallen from grace. So she smiled at dinners she could barely afford to host. She curtsied to guests while calculating, silently, how many more months the house could survive. And she told no one, not even Mrs. Hale, the only person she trusted, exactly how thin the thread had become. The morning began like any other, until Mr. Grayson arrived unannounced, his carriage pulling up the drive with an urgency that immediately unsettled the household staff. Rosalind's uncle rarely visited without warning, and when he did, it was never for pleasant reasons. She watched from an upstairs window as he stepped down, straightened his coat, and gave instructions to a servant she did not recognize, instructions delivered with the confidence of a man who believed the house already belonged to him. By mid-morning, she learned there was to be a meeting. Not a social call, not a family visit, but a private gathering in the study, arranged, as far as she could tell, without her knowledge or her consent. Miss Hale attempted to explain, her voice careful and apologetic, that Mr. Grayson had informed the staff only that evening, insisting the matter did not concern the young mistress of the house. A phrase that struck Rosalind like a slap, given that every matter concerning Whitfield Hall concerned her, and her alone. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons of her gown, refusing to let herself be shut out of a decision made beneath her own roof. Whatever this meeting was, whoever had been invited, she intended to be present. She did not yet know that the man waiting in her father's study was not simply another creditor or solicitor summoned by her uncle. She did not yet know that the meeting Grayson had tried so carefully to hide from her would change the course of her entire life before the sun had fully risen over Whitfield Hall. She entered the study with her chin lifted, prepared to face whatever conversation her uncle had arranged without her. What she had not prepared herself for was the sight that greeted her the moment she crossed the threshold. A stranger, seated calmly at the head of the long table, in the exact chair that had remained untouched for 3 years. His posture was relaxed, his dark coat impeccably tailored, his expression unreadable as he glanced briefly toward the door before returning his attention to the papers spread before him. For a moment, Rosalind could not move. It was not simply that a stranger occupied a chair reserved, in her mind, for no one but her father's memory. It was the ease with which he sat there, as though the seat belonged to him, as though he had every right in the world to claim it. Her uncle stood beside the window, watching her reaction with something close to satisfaction, while 2 other men occupied chairs along the table. One, she would later learn, the Duke's own solicitor, the other retained by her uncle, murmuring quietly over papers already spread between them, as though the matter had been all but settled before she had ever crossed the threshold. No one had introduced the stranger. No one had explained why he sat where he sat, and in the rising heat of her indignation, Rosalind found she did not care to wait for an introduction. Grief and anger and 3 years of carefully guarded pride collided inside her all at once, and before she could stop herself, before she could consider the consequences of what she was about to do, she took a step forward, her voice steady despite the storm building beneath it. "That chair," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the low murmur of the room, "belongs to my father." The words landed with a weight that silenced every conversation at once. The 2 unfamiliar men exchanged a glance, her uncle's face drained of color. But the stranger simply looked up at her, his expression calm, almost curious, as though her interruption were the most interesting thing that had happened to him all week. "I beg your pardon," he said, his tone neither defensive nor apologetic, simply measured, as if weighing her words rather than reacting to them. Rosalind did not soften. She had spent 3 years watching this house nearly fall apart while holding herself together through sheer will, and she was not about to let a stranger sit in her father's place without at least hearing her say so. "You are welcome in this house," she continued, "but that seat is not yours to take. I don't know who invited you here or why, but I will not stand by while a man I've never met sits where my father once sat." The room remained utterly still. Her uncle opened his mouth as though to intervene, then closed it again, apparently deciding that whatever happened next was best left to unfold without his interference. The stranger studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Not offense, not anger, but a quiet, deliberate attention, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time and deciding, in that instant, that she was not at all what he had expected to find in this house. What Rosalind did not know, in that single defiant moment, was that the man she had just corrected would soon hold her family's entire fate in his hands, and that the next words out of his mouth would change everything she believed about the danger she had just walked into. The silence that followed was different from any Rosalind had known within these walls. It was not the hushed, respectful quiet of mourning, nor the careful stillness of a household protecting its secrets. It was the silence of witnesses waiting to see what would happen when a young woman with nothing left to lose spoke a truth no one else in the room had dared to voice. She felt the weight of every eye upon her, her uncle's fury barely restrained, the two strangers' quiet astonishment, and above all, the steady, unblinking gaze of the man still seated in her father's chair. For a moment, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Whatever business had brought these men into her home clearly mattered a great deal to her uncle, and she had just interrupted it with a declaration that could easily be mistaken for the outburst of an overly sentimental girl rather than the righteous defense of a daughter's grief. She lifted her chin regardless, refusing to let the silence shame her into retreat. If this house still belonged, even partly, to her father's memory, then she had every right to speak for it. The stranger, however, showed no sign of anger. If anything, the quiet stretching between them seemed to interest him more than trouble him. He set down the paper he had been holding, folded his hands atop the table, and regarded Rosalind with the unhurried patience of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and equally accustomed to recognizing immediately the rare moment when he was not. What Rosalind could not have known, standing there with her pride still burning hot in her chest, was that the man she had just corrected in front of her uncle and two strangers was not a solicitor, nor a creditor's agent, nor any of the minor officials who so often darkened her family's doorway in recent months. The man seated in her father's chair was Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe, one of the most influential men in the county, and, unbeknownst to Rosalind, the holder of the largest outstanding mortgage against Whitfield Hall, purchased quietly from a struggling bank 2 years earlier as a favor to a family his own father had once called friend. His signature alone could determine whether Whitfield Hall survived the year or was lost entirely to its debts. Her uncle had arranged this meeting in secret precisely because he understood what Rosalind did not, that the Duke held in his possession the mortgage papers and loan notes capable of deciding the fate of her home, her name, and everything her father had built. Grayson had hoped to negotiate quietly, to present himself as the rightful voice of the family before his niece could interfere with sentiment or objection. He had not accounted for Rosalind discovering the meeting at all, and he certainly had not accounted for her walking into the room and speaking to the Duke as though he were nothing more than an ill-mannered guest. The Duke, for his part, had grown so accustomed to deference, to rooms falling silent out of respect rather than defiance, that Rosalind's correction had struck him with a force far greater than she could have imagined. No one had spoken to him in such a manner in years. And though she did not yet know his name or his power, something in her fearless honesty had already begun to shift the quiet, careful calculations forming behind his composed expression. The moment the initial shock of the room began to fade, Edmund Grayson moved quickly to regain control of a situation rapidly slipping beyond his grasp. He stepped forward with a tight, apologetic smile, bowing slightly toward the head of the table as though to erase, through sheer performance, the insult his niece had just delivered. "Forgive her, Your Grace," he said, his voice smooth despite the tension visible in his jaw. "My niece is unaccustomed to matters of business. She does not understand the purpose of this meeting." Rosalind turned toward her uncle, disbelief flickering across her face at the ease with which he dismissed her, as though her objection had been born of ignorance rather than justified grief. "I understand perfectly well," she said, her voice quieter now but no less firm. that a meeting was arranged in my own home without my knowledge, concerning matters that affect my future as much as anyone's. Grayson's smile faltered for the briefest moment before he recovered it, casting a glance toward the Duke as though seeking permission to continue, as if she had not spoken at all. But the Duke did not offer him that permission. Instead, he raised a hand slightly, a small, unhurried gesture that nonetheless silenced Grayson instantly. "I would like to hear what the young lady has to say," he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that left no room for argument. Rosalind watched her uncle's composure crack for just a moment, and in that fracture she caught her first true glimpse of how much this man, whoever he was, truly controlled the room, and how little control her uncle actually held over the fate of Whitfield Hall. For a long moment, the Duke said nothing further. He simply observed. The tension between Rosalind and her uncle, the barely concealed panic beneath Grayson's forced civility, the quiet dignity with which Rosalind held her ground, despite clearly having no idea whom she addressed. It was a silence that unsettled everyone in the room except perhaps the two men chosen to observe the negotiations, and Rosalind herself was too consumed by her own indignation to notice how closely she was being studied. He had come to Whitfield Hall expecting a straightforward transaction, a review of debts, a discussion of terms, perhaps an uncomfortable negotiation with a nephew eager to settle his late brother-in-law's affairs as quickly and quietly as possible. He had not expected to be corrected by a young woman with fire in her eyes and grief still fresh in her voice, nor had he expected to feel, in that correction, something oddly close to admiration. Few people in his life spoke to him without calculating the cost of doing so first. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the irritation Grayson clearly expected. "Perhaps," he said slowly, his gaze still fixed on Rosalind, "it would be best if the meeting continued another day, once all parties concerned have been properly informed." The words were simple, yet they landed like a quiet earthquake beneath Grayson's carefully constructed plans. Rosalind did not yet understand the full weight of what had just occurred. But she understood, with sudden clarity, that whoever this stranger was, he had just taken her side without a single word of apology from her, and without demanding one in return. News of what had occurred within the walls of Whitfield Hall did not remain contained for long. By the following afternoon, fragments of the story had already begun circulating among the households of the county. A young woman, alone and grieving, had scolded a nobleman in her father's study, unaware of his identity, until the moment had already passed beyond recall. Each retelling added its own embellishment, until the truth of the encounter blurred into something far more scandalous than what had actually occurred. Rosalind first became aware of the whispers at a modest gathering hosted by a family friend, where conversations halted awkwardly the moment she entered a room, and where sidelong glances followed her from the drawing room to the garden. Mrs. Hale, ever protective, urged her not to concern herself with idle gossip, insisting that whatever people chose to say behind closed doors mattered far less than the truth of her own conduct. But Rosalind could not so easily dismiss the sensation of being watched, judged, and quietly dissected by a society always eager for a fresh scandal involving a family already teetering on the edge of ruin. What unsettled her most was not the gossip itself, but the uncertainty it revealed. She still did not know the name of the man she had corrected, nor the true purpose of the meeting her uncle had tried so carefully to hide from her. She only knew that whoever he was, his opinion of her now traveled through drawing rooms and dinner parties faster than she could control, shaping a reputation she had not yet had the chance to defend. And somewhere beneath the county's eager whispers, a decision was quietly forming in the mind of a man whose name she had not even thought to ask. If you're enjoying watching Rosalind stand her ground against a world determined to break her, hit that subscribe button now. There's a lot more to this story, and you'll want to be here for every twist that's still coming. It was Mrs. Hale who finally sat Rosalind down, late one evening when the rest of the household had gone to sleep, and the fire in the small parlor had burned low enough that its light barely reached the corners of the room. The older woman had served the Whitfield family for over 20 years, long enough to remember Rosalind as a child running barefoot through the gardens, and long enough to recognize when silence had become more dangerous than honesty. She spoke carefully, choosing her words the way one might choose footing on unstable ground, and told Rosalind what she had long suspected but never dared to confirm, that her father's finances had begun crumbling years before his death, hidden behind a lifetime of pride, generosity, and an unwillingness to admit failure even to himself. Lord Whitfield had been a man beloved by nearly everyone who knew him, but beloved men were not always careful men, and his generosity toward friends, tenants, and distant relatives had slowly eroded a fortune that once seemed limitless. Loans had been extended without proper documentation. Investments had been made on the strength of friendship rather than sound judgment. And when illness finally took him, after a decline of many months that he insisted, almost until the end, was nothing serious, he left behind not the stable inheritance everyone assumed, but a labyrinth of debts so carefully concealed that even his own daughter had spent years believing the house was simply passing through a difficult season rather than standing on the edge of collapse. Rosalind listened in stunned silence as the full weight of her father's hidden burden settled over her like a physical thing, pressing against her chest until she could hardly draw breath. She thought of every dinner she had hosted on borrowed confidence, every smile she had offered guests while quietly calculating what could be sold next. Every night she had told herself that if she simply worked hard enough, prayed hard enough, held the house together with sheer force of will, everything would eventually right itself. Now she understood that the crisis she had been fighting for 3 years was not a temporary setback, but the long, slow unraveling of a debt her father had never found the courage to face, and one she alone had inherited the responsibility of untangling, whether she was prepared for it or not. In the days that followed her conversation with Mrs. Hale, Rosalind began paying closer attention to details she had previously dismissed as unimportant. The frequency of her uncle's visits, the private conversations he held with solicitors in rooms she was rarely invited to enter, the careful way he always seemed to know more about the state of the family's finances than he ever chose to share with her directly. What she had once attributed to simple concern for her welfare now struck her as something far more calculated, though she could not yet name exactly what it was that troubled her so deeply about his behavior. She began, quietly and without informing anyone, to review the household's correspondence more carefully than she had before, comparing figures in her father's old ledgers against the numbers her uncle had presented to her as fact. Small discrepancies emerged first, minor sums that did not quite align, dates that seemed inconsistent with the timeline Grayson had described. Individually, each discrepancy might have been dismissed as an honest error, the kind of small confusion that arises naturally when managing years of complicated accounts. But together, arranged side by side across her father's old writing desk, they began to form the outline of something far more deliberate, a pattern too consistent to be accidental. The realization crept over her slowly, the way cold water rises around ankles left too long in a shallow stream. First a discomfort easily ignored, then an undeniable chill that could no longer be dismissed. Her uncle had positioned himself patiently and methodically as the sole authority over her father's remaining estate, ensuring that every decision, every negotiation, every meeting passed through his hands first. And the meeting the Duke had attended, the one Grayson had tried so desperately to keep hidden from her, now seemed less like an unfortunate oversight, and more like a carefully constructed opportunity, one designed to settle the fate of Whitfield Hall before Rosalind ever had the chance to understand what was truly at stake. She thought she was only uncovering a pattern of small mistakes. She had no idea that a single letter, sealed and waiting, was about to arrive at her door. One that would force her to face the very man she had humiliated, this time with no room left to hide. The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, delivered not by the usual post but by a liveried servant who waited at the door until Rosalind herself appeared to receive it personally. The paper was heavy, expensive, sealed with wax bearing an insignia she did not recognize, though something in its weight and formality told her immediately that this was no ordinary correspondence. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, and her breath caught when she read the elegant, unhurried script requesting the honor of a private audience. Signed simply, with the title that finally revealed to her exactly whom she had corrected in her father's study. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe. The name struck her with a force she had not anticipated, and for a long moment she simply stood in the entryway, the letter trembling between her fingers, as the full weight of her earlier boldness settled over her in waves of mortification. She had scolded a duke. She had spoken to one of the most powerful men in the county, as though he were nothing more than an ill-mannered stranger overstepping his welcome. And now that same man was requesting to see her privately, for reasons his letter did not explain, in a tone that gave her no indication whether she should expect forgiveness or further consequence. Mrs. Hale found her still standing there several minutes later, the letter clutched against her chest, her expression caught somewhere between panic and disbelief. When Rosalind finally managed to explain what the letter contained, the older woman's reaction surprised her. Not alarm, but a quiet, thoughtful curiosity, as though she sensed something in this unexpected invitation that Rosalind herself had not yet considered. "A duke does not request a private audience with a young woman who has merely offended him," Mrs. Hale said carefully, folding her hands before her. "He simply dismisses her from his thoughts entirely. This is something else, my dear. And I think you already suspect it." Rosalind arrived at the appointed hour dressed with careful restraint, choosing a gown modest enough to avoid any accusation of vanity, yet elegant enough to suggest she had not entirely lost her composure in the days since their first encounter. She was shown into a small drawing room she did not recognize as belonging to Whitfield Hall's usual receiving spaces, a room her uncle rarely used, tucked away near the eastern wing, as though the Duke had specifically requested privacy away from the household's more public gathering places. Her heart beat unevenly as she waited, replaying every possible version of what he might say to her, none of which brought her any comfort. When he entered, he carried himself with the same unhurried composure she remembered from their first meeting, though something in his expression seemed softer now, less guarded than it had been surrounded by her uncle's tense negotiations. He greeted her with a formal bow, precisely correct in every detail. Yet there was a warmth beneath the formality that she had not expected, a quiet attentiveness in the way his eyes met hers, as though genuinely curious what she might say now that she finally understood who he was. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice steady, "I believe an introduction is long overdue between us. I am Julian Ashcombe." The name settled over her like a confirmation of everything she had feared, and everything Mrs. Hale had gently suggested might also be true. She curtsied, her voice barely steady as she offered the apology she had rehearsed a dozen times since receiving his letter, expressing regret for her conduct, for her assumptions, for the humiliation she feared she had caused him in front of witnesses who would surely carry the story throughout the county for months to come. But before she could finish, before she could complete the careful, contrite speech she had prepared, he raised a hand gently, the same quiet gesture she remembered from the study, and the words he spoke next were nothing at all like what she had expected to hear. "Before we find out exactly what the Duke says to her, make sure you're subscribed. so this story doesn't get lost in your feed. What comes next changes the entire direction of Rosalind's life. I did not invite you here for an apology, he said, his tone measured but unmistakably sincere, and Rosalind felt the careful speech she had prepared crumble uselessly in her throat. He gestured toward a chair near the window, waiting until she had seated herself before taking his own place across from her, close enough that she could study his expression clearly, yet far enough to maintain the proper distance propriety demanded. In truth, he continued, I have spent a great deal of time these past days considering our first meeting, and I find myself unable to regard it with anything resembling offense. Rosalind stared at him, uncertain whether she had heard him correctly. Every instinct told her that a man of his rank, corrected so publicly and so firmly by a woman he had never met, should have responded with cold dismissal at best, quiet retaliation at worst. Instead, he studied her now with something that looked remarkably like admiration, as though her willingness to defend her father's memory, even at the cost of embarrassing herself before strangers, had impressed him far more than any careful, calculated courtesy could have managed. Most people who enter a room where I am seated, he said slowly, concern themselves first with securing my favor. You concerned yourself first with your father's memory. I confess, Miss Whitfield, I have not encountered such conviction in a very long time. She did not know how to respond to such an admission, nor did she fully trust the warmth spreading through her chest at his words. Warmth she quickly reminded herself she could not afford to indulge, not when her family's entire future depended on remaining composed and careful in his presence. And yet, as the conversation continued, drifting gradually from formal apology into something closer to genuine exchange, Rosalind began to sense, with quiet unease, that whatever business had originally brought Julian Ashcombe to Whitfield Hall, it was no longer the only reason he intended to return. Their second meeting was arranged with far less formality than the first, though no less care. Julian had sent word requesting to walk the grounds of Whitfield Hall, explaining, with a directness Rosalind had come to recognize as characteristic of him, that he wished to see the gardens her father had once been known for cultivating with his own hands. She agreed, cautiously, telling herself it was simply good manners to accommodate a man whose opinion could determine her family's fate, though some quieter, more honest part of her recognized that she was also, unmistakably, curious to know more about him. They walked together along the gravel paths her father had designed decades earlier, past rose bushes now overgrown from years of neglected attention, and Rosalind found herself speaking more freely than she had intended, describing memories of her father tending these very beds himself, insisting that a man's character could be measured by how patiently he cared for things that could not thank him for the effort. Julian listened with an attentiveness that surprised her, asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation, and gradually she realized that he was not simply humoring her. He seemed sincerely interested in understanding the man whose chair he had once, unknowingly, offended her by occupying. He must have been a remarkable man, Julian said quietly, pausing beside a stone bench half swallowed by ivy. To have raised a daughter willing to defend his memory so fiercely, even against a stranger holding considerable power over her family's future. Rosalind felt something tighten in her throat at the observation, unprepared for how deeply it moved her to hear her father spoken of with such genuine respect by a man who had never known him. She realized, with quiet surprise, that she wanted Julian Ashcombe to understand her father, not as a cautionary tale of mismanaged debts, but as the man who had taught her, through every small kindness, exactly what it meant to protect something worth protecting. Neither of them yet suspected how soon that quiet trust would be tested. Not by strangers, but by people close enough to strike where it would hurt the most. It was during a small gathering hosted by a family friend, weeks after her private conversations with Julian had begun, that Rosalind first heard her father's failures spoken of openly, carelessly, by guests who assumed the subject harmless, simply because it concerned a man no longer present to hear their judgment. A distant acquaintance of her uncle's remarked, with a laugh that struck Rosalind as unbearably cruel, that Lord Whitfield had always possessed more generosity than sense, and that it was hardly surprising his daughter now found herself scrambling to salvage what little remained of his poorly managed estate. The room did not fall silent the way it had in her father's study weeks earlier, but Rosalind felt every syllable of the comment land against her chest like a physical blow, and before she could stop herself, before she could remember the careful composure she had spent years cultivating in public settings, she found her voice rising above the polite murmur of conversation surrounding her. My father's generosity fed families through winters they could not otherwise have survived, she said, her tone controlled but unmistakably fierce. If that generosity cost him more than careful men would have spent, then I would rather carry the burden of his kindness than inherit the comfortable cruelty of men who measure worth only in coin. The room fell quiet in a different way this time, not the shocked silence of scandal, but something closer to reluctant respect, as several guests exchanged glances that suggested her words had struck closer to truth than they cared to admit aloud. Julian, standing near the edge of the gathering, said nothing, though Rosalind caught his expression as she finished speaking, and something in the quiet intensity of his gaze told her that whatever admiration he had begun to feel for her during their private conversations had only deepened, watching her defend a man who could no longer defend himself, with the same unflinching conviction she had once turned against Julian himself. The discovery came almost by accident, on an evening when Rosalind had retreated to her father's old study seeking nothing more than quiet solitude, away from the household's growing tensions. She had not intended to search for anything in particular, but her fingers, moving absently along the underside of the great oak desk her father had used for decades, discovered a small, cleverly concealed compartment she had never noticed before, hidden beneath a panel that appeared, at first glance, to be nothing more than decorative molding. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from damp and dust, she found a leather-bound ledger far older and more detailed than any of the accounts her uncle had presented to her over the past 3 years. Her hands trembled as she opened it beneath the dim light of a single candle, scanning entries written in her father's familiar, careful script, records of loans extended, properties held, and, most strikingly, notes regarding arrangements made with her uncle years before her father's death. Arrangements that painted an entirely different picture than the one Grayson had so carefully constructed for her. She read late into the night, piecing together fragments of a story her father had apparently never intended to share, not out of secrecy, but out of a father's instinct to shield his daughter from burdens he believed were his, alone to carry. What emerged from those pages was not the picture of a careless man whose generosity had ruined his family, but the outline of a man who had trusted his brother-in-law with responsibilities he should never have surrendered so completely. Trust that Edmund Grayson, Rosalind now understood with rising, cold certainty, had exploited far more deliberately than she had previously dared to imagine. When Rosalind confronted her uncle the following morning, ledger in hand, she expected denial, perhaps even anger, but she had not anticipated the smooth, practiced ease with which Grayson met her accusations, as though he had long ago prepared himself for precisely this moment. He listened to her carefully, his expression arranging itself into something resembling patient concern, before explaining, in the calm tone of a man accustomed to being believed, that the ledger reflected nothing more than the confused record-keeping of a dying man whose judgment, toward the end, had grown increasingly unreliable. "Your father trusted me completely," he said, his voice steady despite the accusation hanging heavy in the air between them. "Whatever you believe you found in that ledger, I assure you, represents nothing more than his final, well-intentioned but poorly executed attempts to organize affairs he no longer fully understood." Rosalind studied her uncle carefully as he spoke, searching his face for any crack in the composed performance he presented. But Grayson had clearly rehearsed this explanation, delivering it with the practiced confidence of a man who had anticipated this confrontation long before it arrived. What troubled her most was not his explanation itself, but the ease with which he offered it, the same smooth reassurance he had used countless times over the past 3 years to guide her toward decisions that, she now suspected, had served his interests far more than her family's. She left the conversation no closer to certainty than when she had entered it, but with a growing, unshakable conviction that the truth of her father's final years lay somewhere between her uncle's careful explanations and the quiet, damning evidence hidden within the pages of a ledger he clearly wished she had never discovered. She brought the ledger to Julian, not out of any calculated strategy, but out of a growing need to speak with someone whose judgment she trusted, and whose position gave him the resources to investigate what she alone could not. He listened without interruption as she explained everything: the discrepancies she had noticed in the household accounts, the secret compartment beneath her father's desk, her uncle's smooth but unconvincing explanation. And when she finally finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, studying the ledger's careful entries with the focused attention of a man accustomed to reading between the polished surfaces of other people's carefully constructed stories. "Your uncle," he said finally, closing the ledger with deliberate care, "has positioned himself as the sole authority over your father's estate for reasons that, I confess, have troubled me since our very first meeting. A man managing an estate honestly rarely feels the need to arrange private meetings behind the back of the person that estate ultimately belongs to." Rosalind felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a validation of suspicions she had barely allowed herself to fully articulate, even to Mrs. Hale, for fear of sounding paranoid or ungrateful toward the uncle who had, at least outwardly, presented himself as her family's protector. Julian's expression grew more serious as he considered the implications further, and Rosalind watched him transform, subtly but unmistakably, from the patient companion who had walked her father's gardens into the shrewd, formidable nobleman whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of Whitfield Hall. "I will look into this matter personally," he said, meeting her eyes with quiet resolve. "Not simply as a matter of business, Miss Whitfield, but because I find I am no longer willing to stand by while your family's legacy is quietly dismantled by a man more concerned with his own advancement than with honoring the trust your father placed in him." As the weeks progressed, the whispers surrounding Rosalind grew louder rather than fading, as gossip so often did when left unaddressed. What had begun as a scandalous anecdote about a young woman scolding a duke had, through the slow, deliberate machinery of society's rumor mill, transformed into something far more damaging, a narrative that painted her as scheming, ambitious, deliberately positioning herself to secure the attention of one of the county's most eligible and powerful men. She heard fragments of these stories wherever she went, delivered in tones of false sympathy by acquaintances who seemed to relish the opportunity to dissect her reputation from behind polite smiles. The cruelest version of the story, she learned from Mrs. Hale, suggested that Rosalind had orchestrated the entire encounter in her father's study deliberately, staging her outburst as a calculated performance designed to catch the Duke's attention rather than as the genuine, unguarded grief it had actually been. The suggestion wounded her more deeply than she expected, not because she feared for her own reputation alone, but because it cheapened the memory of her father into nothing more than a convenient prop in a scheme she had never intended to enact. She found herself increasingly isolated at social gatherings, watched with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion by women who had once considered her merely unremarkable, and now regarded her as something far more dangerous. Rosalind refused to let the rumors change her conduct, though they could not help but change how she carried herself in public. More guarded now, more careful with every word. Aware that any gesture, any glance exchanged with Julian in company would be scrutinized and reshaped into further evidence of a scheme that existed only in the imagination of a society hungry for scandal. She told herself repeatedly that she owed these whispers no explanation, that her conduct had always been honest even when it had been unwise. But some nights, alone in the quiet of her chamber, she could not entirely silence the fear that her father's name, already burdened by hidden debts, was now being further tarnished by a scandal she had never intended to create. The moment came at a formal dinner hosted by one of the county's most prominent families, an event Rosalind had nearly declined attending, dreading the inevitable whispers that would follow her through every room. She arrived with careful composure, determined to endure the evening with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the preceding weeks, though she could feel the weight of curious glances following her from the moment she stepped through the door. It was during the second course, as conversation turned inevitably toward the scandal that had followed her for weeks, that Lady Pemberton, seated several places down the table, remarked with deliberate cruelty that some young women seemed remarkably skilled at securing a duke's attention through carefully staged displays of sentiment. The table fell into an uncomfortable silence, guests exchanging uneasy glances, uncertain whether to laugh at the pointed remark or pretend it had not been directed quite so obviously toward Rosalind, seated near the center of the gathering with her fork frozen halfway to her plate. Before she could formulate any response, before humiliation could fully settle over her in front of the assembled guests, Julian's voice cut through the tension with a calm, deliberate authority that immediately commanded the attention of everyone present. "I have known a great many women who calculate their every word for advantage," he said, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. "Miss Whitfield is not among them. I have rarely encountered anyone less concerned with securing my favor and considerably more concerned with defending the memory of a father she lost far too soon." The silence that followed his words carried an entirely different weight than the silence that had preceded them. Not scandal, but recognition, as guests around the table reconsidered, visibly, the narrative they had so eagerly constructed over the preceding weeks. Rosalind felt heat rise to her cheeks, overwhelmed by the public nature of his defense. Yet beneath the embarrassment ran something steadier, something that felt remarkably like relief. Knowing that whatever else remained uncertain about her future, at least one person in that room had refused to let cruelty pass unanswered. But Julian's public defense had done more than silence one cruel remark. It had declared, without either of them fully realizing it yet, exactly whose side he had chosen. And not everyone in that room was willing to accept defeat so quietly. Lady Constance Pemberton had spent the better part of 2 seasons carefully cultivating what she considered an inevitable understanding between herself and the Duke of Ashcombe, an arrangement built upon family connections, mutual social standing, and the quiet, persistent assumption that a man of Julian's position would naturally choose a wife whose background matched his own in wealth and prestige. Rosalind's sudden, unexpected presence in his life represented not merely an inconvenience, but a genuine threat to ambitions Lady Constance had spent years carefully constructing, and she was not a woman inclined to surrender such ambitions without a fight, however quiet and carefully disguised that fight might appear to outside observers. Where her earlier remarks at the dinner table had been public and direct, Lady Constance's subsequent efforts grew considerably more subtle, woven into private conversations designed to reach Julian indirectly through mutual acquaintances, rather than through confrontations he could easily dismiss or defend against. She suggested, delicately, and without ever naming Rosalind directly, that a man in Julian's position ought to consider carefully the wisdom of associating too closely with a family whose finances remained, by all accounts, in considerable disarray, implying, without stating outright, that whatever affection had developed between them was as likely rooted in Rosalind's calculated self-interest as in any genuine sentiment. She also began, quietly and carefully, cultivating a closer alliance with Edmund Grayson, recognizing in him a shared interest in seeing Rosalind's growing influence over the Duke diminished before it could develop into something neither of them could easily undo. Their conversations remained carefully veiled beneath polite social pretense, but Rosalind, increasingly attuned to the subtle currents moving beneath the surface of her interactions with society, began to sense that her uncle's schemes and Lady Constance's ambitions were converging into something far more coordinated and dangerous than either threat alone had previously represented. Despite the mounting pressures surrounding them both, something steady and unhurried continued growing between Rosalind and Julian, built not upon grand romantic gestures, but upon the quiet accumulation of small, genuine moments, conversations that lingered longer than strictly necessary, comfortable silences shared while walking the gardens her father had once tended. The particular way Julian listened to her, fully and without distraction, as though her words carried a weight he found nowhere else in the carefully performed conversations that typically filled his days. Rosalind found herself, almost without realizing it, beginning to trust him with thoughts and fears she had shared with no one else, not even Mrs. Hale. She told him, during one quiet afternoon in the library, about the particular loneliness of managing a household's collapse while maintaining a public appearance of perfect composure, about nights spent calculating figures by candlelight while guests believed her simply retiring early from social fatigue. Julian listened without offering easy reassurances or empty comfort, understanding instinctively that what she needed was not solutions, but simply the relief of being fully seen, her burdens acknowledged rather than dismissed or minimized. In turn, he shared with her fragments of his own guarded history, the isolation that came with a position everyone assumed enviable, the difficulty of trusting affection that might easily be motivated by title rather than genuine regard. Their growing closeness remained carefully restrained by propriety, conducted always within the boundaries society demanded. Yet Rosalind sensed, with quiet certainty, that whatever was developing between them had moved well beyond the polite formalities of a duke's obligation toward a troubled family's affairs. She found herself, despite every practical instinct warning her against such vulnerability, beginning to hope for something she had not allowed herself to consider in years. Not merely the rescue of Whitfield Hall from ruin, but the possibility of a genuine partnership built upon mutual respect rather than desperate necessity. The discovery arrived through Julian's investigation rather than through any further searching of her own, delivered to Rosalind on a quiet evening when he requested an urgent private audience, his expression carrying a gravity that immediately warned her the news he brought was significant. He had, through careful inquiry among his own solicitors and contacts, uncovered correspondence her father had written shortly before his death, a letter apparently intended for Rosalind herself but never delivered, discovered instead among documents Edmund Grayson had long kept carefully hidden from view. The letter, when Rosalind finally read it with trembling hands, revealed a truth far more damning than anything the ledger alone had suggested. Her father, it seemed, had grown suspicious of Grayson's management of the estate in his final months, suspicious enough to begin quietly documenting irregularities he intended to address once his health improved sufficiently to confront his brother-in-law directly. He had never gotten the chance. The letter, written with the careful, urgent honesty of a dying man determined to protect his daughter even from beyond the grave, warned Rosalind explicitly against trusting her uncle's management of the estate without independent verification, though illness had claimed him before he could deliver this warning in person. Rosalind wept, reading her father's words, overwhelmed not only by the painful confirmation of her uncle's betrayal, but by the profound tenderness evident in every line her father had written, his final thoughts consumed not with fear for himself, but with determination to protect the daughter he would not live to see grown into the woman capable of finally uncovering the truth he had died trying to warn her about. Julian remained quietly beside her as she read, offering no words, simply the steady, reassuring presence of someone who understood that some grief required witnessing rather than solving. And in that shared silence, surrounded by evidence of her father's final, desperate love, Rosalind felt something in her harden into unshakable resolve. Whatever came next, Edmund Grayson would finally answer for what he had done. Julian arranged the second meeting with the same careful formality as the first, though this time Rosalind entered her father's study not as an unwelcome interruption, but as the guest of honor, invited deliberately to sit at the very table where her humiliation had first begun. Edmund Grayson arrived expecting another routine negotiation, his composure firmly in place, and it was not until he stepped fully into the room and saw both Julian and Rosalind seated together, the recovered ledger and her father's letter arranged deliberately upon the table between them, that his carefully maintained confidence began, visibly, to falter. Julian spoke first, his voice carrying the same calm authority Rosalind had come to recognize as characteristic of him, though today it carried an edge of controlled anger she had not previously witnessed. He laid out, methodically, and without theatrical flourish, everything his investigation had uncovered. The falsified accounts, the loans quietly redirected toward Grayson's own private interests, the systematic isolation of Rosalind from any genuine understanding of her family's true financial position. Grayson attempted, briefly, to offer the same smooth explanations he had once used so successfully against Rosalind alone. But against the combined weight of documented evidence and the Duke's unwavering authority, his practiced excuses collapsed almost immediately into desperate, unconvincing denial. It was Rosalind, finally, who spoke the words that ended her uncle's carefully constructed deception entirely, her voice steady with a confidence that bore no resemblance to the uncertain grief that had driven her first outburst in this very room. "You believed," she said quietly, meeting her uncle's eyes without flinching, "that a grieving daughter would be too consumed by loss to notice what you were quietly stealing from beneath her. You were wrong. My father taught me to protect what matters, even when it costs me comfort to do so. I do not intend to stop now, simply because the truth has become inconvenient for you." Grayson, cornered by evidence he could no longer dismiss, finally fell silent, his authority over Whitfield Hall's affairs ending as decisively as it had once begun. Before the meeting closed, Julian turned to the matter that had first brought him to that table months earlier, the mortgage he held against Whitfield Hall. In front of Grayson, and with Rosalind's own signature now the only one required, he restructured the debt entirely into her name alone, striking out every clause that had once given her uncle any claim over the estate's affairs. What had begun as a negotiation designed to strip Rosalind of her home ended, instead, with the house belonging, fully and legally, to her. The weeks following Grayson's exposure brought significant, if gradual, change to Whitfield Hall and to Rosalind's, standing within a society that had so recently delighted in questioning her character. With Julian's support, and the undeniable evidence contained within her father's own ledger and letter, the true circumstances of the estate's mismanagement became known throughout the county, transforming public perception with the same swift efficiency that had once spread rumors of her supposed scheming. Where whispers had once painted her as calculating and ambitious, They now spoke instead of her courage, her loyalty, and the remarkable determination with which she had uncovered and confronted a betrayal. Most young women in her position would never have possessed the resources or resolve to challenge. Julian did not allow Grayson's disgrace to remain a private matter. He brought the falsified accounts before the county magistrate himself, and within weeks the same drawing rooms that had once whispered about Rosalind's supposed scheming were whispering instead about her uncle's fraud. A reversal so complete that Grayson found every door in the county closed to him before he finally departed for the continent. His reputation ruined beyond repair, and his access to any further influence over Whitfield Hall permanently severed by law. Lady Constance, recognizing that her earlier alliance with Grayson now represented a liability rather than an advantage, withdrew from her pursuit of Julian's attention with as much quiet dignity as she could manage, understanding that whatever chance she had, once believed herself to possess, had ended definitively the moment his loyalty to Rosalind had been so publicly and unmistakably declared. With the mortgage restructured fully into her name, and the funds Grayson had diverted gradually, recovered through the courts, Rosalind found herself, for the first time in 3 years, able to walk through Whitfield Hall's halls without the constant, exhausting calculation of hidden debts and carefully guarded secrets. She sold nothing further. She turned no more tradesmen away at odd hours. The house itself seemed to breathe more easily around her, its portraits and gardens no longer monuments to a slow, hidden decline, but genuine testaments to a legacy she had fought, successfully and completely, to protect and restore. Her father's name, once threatened by whispers of mismanagement and hidden failure, now stood fully vindicated, remembered not for the debts he had unknowingly left behind, but for the daughter whose fierce loyalty had ultimately proven strong enough to set the entire truth right. On a quiet afternoon several months later, Julian returned to Whitfield Hall not for business, nor for further investigation, but for a conversation he had been carefully preparing for weeks, one that had nothing to do with debts or ledgers and everything to do with the quiet, steady affection that had grown between them since that first, unforgettable morning in her father's study. He found her in the garden, tending the roses her father had once cultivated with such patient devotion, and he watched her for a long moment before speaking, struck again, as he so often was, by the quiet strength she carried so naturally within her. He did not kneel with elaborate declarations, nor did he need to. Instead, he simply took her hand, guiding her gently back toward the house, toward the dining room where their story had first so memorably begun. He led her to the head of the table, her father's chair, the very seat she had once defended so fiercely against a stranger she believed had no right to occupy it, and he gestured toward it with quiet, deliberate reverence. "This seat," he said softly, "has always belonged to your family. I would be honored, Miss Whitfield, if you would allow me the privilege of sitting beside it, rather than within it, for the rest of my life." Rosalind felt tears gather, unbidden, as the full weight of his meaning settled over her. Not a proposal that asked her to abandon her father's legacy, but one that promised to honor it fully, to build something new beside the memory she had fought so hard to protect, rather than replacing it entirely. She said yes, quietly and without hesitation, understanding at last that the empty chair which had haunted her for 3 years no longer represented absence or loss, but the enduring foundation upon which her own future, finally secure and genuinely chosen, could now begin. And as she looked around the dining hall that had once nearly crumbled beneath hidden debts and buried secrets, Rosalind understood, with quiet, unshakable certainty, that some legacies are not lost through hardship, but strengthened by the courage of those willing to fight, honestly and fiercely, to protect them. If this story moved you, If you believe that honesty and quiet courage can outlast even the cruelest betrayal, subscribe to the channel now. New stories like this one are coming, and you won't want to miss what happens next.